What if the biggest deal of your life was seconds away from being signed, and a child you've never met storms in to stop you? That's exactly what happened to Millionaire CEO Nate Harrington, and what unfolded next left Chicago speechless. Before we begin the story, please leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and if you love true stories that inspire, make sure you subscribe. You don't want to miss what happens here. The story begins at the very top of Harrington Tower, the crown jewel of downtown Chicago. From its glass-walled boardroom, the city stretched out like a kingdom below, a kingdom built by one man's relentless ambition. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, heavy with anticipation. This was no ordinary meeting. On the polished marble table lay a merger contract worth billions, the kind of deal that could change the future of Harrington Industries forever. At the head of the table sat Nate Harrington. His presence alone commanded silence. Tall, sharp-suited, and carrying the weight of both respect and fear, Nate was the embodiment of power. Around him sat the company's top executives, their eyes fixed on him, waiting for the moment that would seal their futures. The pen in his hand hovered over the final page, and the air felt electric, as though the entire city was holding its breath. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. And then, it happened. The massive oak doors of the boardroom slammed open with a thunderous crack. Papers trembled. Every head spun toward the noise. And there, framed against the blinding hallway light, stood a little girl. No older than 10, her small figure seemed almost swallowed by the grandeur of the room. Yet her presence cut sharper than any executive's voice. Her clothes were simple, worn. Her hair slightly messy. But it was her eyes, piercing, defiant, that stole the air from the room. Before anyone could even process what was happening, her voice rang out, high and commanding, slicing through the suffocating silence. "Don't sign that document, it's fraud." The words hit like a lightning strike. For a heartbeat, time froze. The pen trembled in Nate's hand. His gaze locked on the child, confusion flashing across his usually unreadable face. Around him, the boardroom erupted into chaos. Executives shot to their feet, shouting in disbelief. Papers fluttered to the floor as hands scrambled to contain the intrusion. Some demanded security, others hissed in anger, their carefully built facade shattering in the space of a single sentence. But the girl did not flinch. She stood in the doorway, chest heaving, as if she had marched into a battlefield she had long prepared for. Her words lingered in the air, heavier than the billions written on the contract. And Nate Harrington, Chicago's untouchable giant, the man who had never paused for anyone, froze with his pen still poised midair. For the first time in years, his certainty cracked. He stared at the girl, a stranger who somehow held the power to shatter everything he thought he knew. The silence that followed wasn't just silence. It was the beginning of a storm. What would you do if a child walked into your world and refused to leave until you listened? That was the question burning in the eyes of every person in the Harrington boardroom the moment the girl stood her ground. Security moved as one, two large men whose job was to remove threats before they could become problems. Their polished shoes echoed on marble. They looked like an answer to the interruption, a tidy solution to a messy problem. But Nate Harrington, who had spent a lifetime rehearsing how to close rooms and close deals, lifted a single hand and the guards stopped. That small gesture felt colossal in the hush that followed. It reframed the room from a place of authority into a space where something fragile demanded consideration. The girl's name, when Nate learned it, landed like a fact from another life, Emily Carter. She was small enough that the tailored chairs swallowed her, but she wore a look that did not belong to someone her age. Her jacket was patched, shoes scuffed, and yet there was an iron-ness to her posture, an old sort of courage that felt almost hereditary. Whispers started like a ripple across the polished table, curiosity sharpening into rumor as the executives exchanged glances. The air tasted suddenly of gossip and threat. Nate watched her closely. He'd been in rooms where men lied with smiles and signed with calm, he'd weathered storms of rumor spun to unmoor him. This, however, was different. A child's voice carried a kind of brutal honesty that no consultant could script. He leaned forward, not because he feared her, but because he needed to understand the force of her conviction. "What makes you think you can walk in here and say that?" he asked, his voice low and steady, the kind that made people drop their defenses. Emily clutched a battered folder as if it were both a shield and a torch. When she answered, the words did not tremble. "Because the man who uncovered the fraud was my father," she said. "And he died because of it." The sentence landed like an accusation and an elegy all at once. It filled the room with a weight that legal briefs and quarterly forecasts had never managed to muster. For a moment, polished executives looked like strangers in a house of mirrors, each reflecting the other's discomfort. Someone at the far end of the table muttered that this was preposterous, that a child's story could not upend layers of due diligence. Another voice suggested calling the police. A third began to reach for damage control protocols. But Nate didn't move to dismiss her. He felt something else. Anger, yes, at the thought of a life taken, but louder was curiosity, a cold, precise kind that had served him in hostile negotiations. He wanted to know who had the audacity to hide corruption behind legalese, who had the care to make a mockery of trust within his own walls. He watched Emily's face for any sign of falsehood and found none, only grief quietly braided with purpose. The room's chatter dimmed into a tense, waiting quiet. Nate's hand curled around the pen on the table as if it were a compass he might use to find a true north. He set his jaw and spoke with the kind of authority that had made him a leader. "Tell me everything," he said. "Start at the beginning." Emily drew a breath that seemed older than her years and opened the folder. The sound was small, but in that instant every head turned, because when a child unspooled a story of adults who lied and a father who paid for the truth, the narrative that followed wouldn't be easy to ignore. Truth rarely arrives dramatic. Sometimes it slips across a table and waits for you to look. Nate Harrington watches Emily push the battered folder toward him as if it were a confession and a weapon at once. He had cleared the boardroom, told the executives to leave. Their murmurs evaporated into the corridor. The private office suddenly felt like the inside of a throat, tight and hollow. The city lights smeared across the floor-to-ceiling windows, long, thin reflections that made the room feel two places at once, above the skyline and beneath it, as if the whole of Chicago were watching. Emily opens the folder with hands that don't tremble as much as they might. Paper fan out, dog-eared pages, coffee rings, margins crowded with handwriting so small and relentless it looks almost like obsession. There are spreadsheets with columns that refuse to line up, sheets of printed emails with headers circled in felt tip, and a stack of coded notes bound with a paperclip. The codes look like a private language. Initials, numbers, a series of shorthand that reads like a map only a watchful person could draw. She speaks slowly, each sentence arranged not for drama but for clarity, the way someone who has rehearsed grief to keep from being swallowed by it might speak. Her father, she explains, worked in accounting at Weston Dynamics. He followed tiny misalignments, an unexpected vendor here, a routing number redirected there, and he traced the pattern until the paper showed him the skeleton behind the suit. He wrote it down, not for glory but because that was what he knew how to do, name things on paper so they could not be denied. Nate looks at the pages and remembers. Faces blur into flashes, a man once polite in a janitor's sweater slipping an envelope across a holiday buffet table, a late-night email flagged and hurriedly closed on Nate's laptop while he juggled investor calls. He remembers hands shaken in celebration and promises whispered over champagne, the soft rhetoric of loyalty that fills rooms just like this. He had taken those promises as scaffolding, he had assumed their plumb lines were true. Now he feels the scaffolding wobble. Emily peels back a sheet and points to a line of numbers. She explains how transfers were masked through shell names, how ownership could be nudged via a single clause tucked into a merger document. Her voice doesn't raise, it doesn't need to. The arithmetic is the scream. Nate runs a finger down the column. The sums don't lie, the pattern does what patterns always do, it reveals a hand where there should have been none. She tells him, softly, that her father tried to expose it. She tells him that she kept the notes because her mother told her to. She tells him the part he has been trying not to let himself inhabit. That the sudden death at the time was never properly investigated, that a man who feared paper more than anything else in the world had been silenced. The phrase, an accident, hangs between them like a mask slipping. The room exhales through glass. Nate feels his stomach drop the way it does when a meeting takes an unexpected turn, but this is not the flinch of a bad quarter. This reaches deeper. The ledger in his hands reframes the last decade, the mergers that made sense, the vendors that appeared overnight, the quiet reshuffling everyone treated as administrative noise. It is not just numbers on a page, it is an accusation printed in alphabet and ink. For a moment he is only a man with a folder, a city spread beneath him, and a choice that has suddenly improbably narrowed. The ground shifts beneath Nate Harrington, not metaphorically but in that deep, animal way you sense when a foundation trembles. The thought that the empire he trusted might be tilted by the greed of its own architects fills him with a cold that has nothing to do with litigation and everything to do with betrayal. He looks at Emily again, at the small, fierce line of her jaw, at the way grief has become resolve, and knows that whatever comes next, it will start here, with these thin, stubborn pages. Morning arrived like a verdict. Light slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows and turned the boardroom into a harsh stage where every face was lit and exposed. Nate Harrington had called an emergency meeting expecting questions, perhaps denials, maybe the polite outrage of men who protected their reputations with talking points. He did not expect the shiver that ran through the room the moment he walked in, the way the air went thin as if everyone had inhaled a secret all at once. The executives sat like soldiers behind a front line of leather chairs. Neat rows of suits, hands folded, eyes alert for anything resembling weakness. They had rehearsed authority for years, they knew how to look untroubled even when the ground under them trembled. Yet Emily, small and still at the far end of the table, made that posture look brittle. Her presence unsettled them in a way a spreadsheet never could. Nate didn't waste breath. He pushed the battered folder across the polished table with the deliberate calm of someone lighting a fuse. The pages fanned open under the glare of the chandelier, printed emails with metadata highlighted, bank transfers listed in rigid columns, ledger entries annotated in a cramped, furious hand. The room smelled faintly of coffee and paper and the sour tang of denials yet to be manufactured. "Explain these," Nate said. His voice carried without a shout. It was the kind of command that used to end debates. Now it felt like a bell ringing over a battlefield. What followed should have been civilized. Instead, it was defensive choreography, a quick intake of breath, a too bright smile, an immediate reference to due diligence and ancillary agreements. One executive, polished and practiced, reached for the language of corporate process as if procedure could shave away accusations. Another suggested a pause, a delay, an independent review, anything to fold this moment into the comforting buffer of bureaucracy. But the numbers did not bow to rhetoric. The signatures on the transactions, names, initials, timestamps, lined up in ways that fingers could follow like a map. Coded memos carried shorthand that connected transfers to a string of shell entities. A clause circled here matched a transfer there. It was elegant, clinical, a trap made with paper and law. The denials grew louder, then thinner. Accusations of fabrication were spat out with the practiced cruelty of people who believed truth was what you could spin into a press release. "This is nonsense," someone barked. "A child's tale." Another voice, oily with condescension, suggested the folder had been planted. The room swelled with the sound of self-preservation. Nate watched every micro-shift, the quick swallow, the dart of the eyes, the fingers rubbing a temple. Those were the tells of men who had relied on opacity. He had built an empire trusting certain faces, signing in good faith where others offered plausible deniability. He had believed that loyalty meant safety. Now the ledger in front of him unstitched those beliefs. Emily sat as if rooted to the table. Her voice had steadied, her hands did not tremble the way the adults did. She had already rehearsed this truth in a darker room, under the hum of a single lamp, tracing the same lines of code and number her father had circled. Each page she'd safeguarded was now a splinter getting pulled from the company's side. The temperature in the room dropped. Tension thickened like storm clouds gathering at the windows. Nate felt something old and buried rise up, regret for missed warnings, a fierce anger aimed at whoever had thought to weaponize legalese against a company and the people who depended on it. He locked eyes with his most trusted partners, scanning faces that had once been the scaffolding of his rise. The calculus that built an empire now stared back at him in human form, pride, fear, and maybe guilt at the edges. For the first time, their suits looked less like armor and more like cages. Nate realized, with a cold clarity that left no room for comfort, that this was not a debate to be settled by committees. This was a reckoning. And in that still, loud moment, he saw the truth for what it was, clear, ugly, and unavoidable. For the first time, Nate didn't see allies, he sees predators. The boardroom, once a stage for power and precision, had unraveled into chaos. Voices clashed like thunder, executives arguing over each other, some shouting, others pleading. The polished table that had seen decades of signed deals and sealed futures now vibrated with fists, slaps of palms, and the sharp edge of desperation. One man, Harrison Blake, the CFO who had stood by Nate through expansion after expansion, rose from his seat and slammed the table so hard the crystal water glasses rattled. His face flushed red, veins straining at his temples. "This is madness," he barked. "You can't let a child derail everything we've worked for. Do you understand the scale of this deal? Billions, Nate. The future of Harrington Industries depends on your signature. Don't throw it away over a bedtime story." The words cut sharp, meant to corner Nate into compliance. But before he could respond, Emily stood. The boardroom, so large and gleaming with its panoramic view of Chicago, seemed to shrink around her small figure. Her sneakers squeaked faintly against the marble floor, her shoulders square though her hands trembled at her sides. She didn't have the power of titles or fortunes, but her eyes burned with something none of the executives could counterfeit, conviction. Her voice quivered at first, but with each word it steadied, slicing through the cacophony. "My father died for this. He died because he refused to stay quiet. He left behind proof, and he told me to protect the truth, no matter what it cost." Her eyes flicked toward Nate, pinning him in place. "If you sign that paper, you're not just signing a contract. You're giving your power to the people who killed him." The room fell into an unnatural silence. It wasn't the polite quiet of business, it was the hollow pause of guilt, of fear, of a truth too sharp to dismiss. The executives, so loud a moment ago, avoided her gaze. Their arguments, once weaponized, now hung useless in the air. Nate felt his chest tighten. The contract sat in front of him, black ink on white pages, still pristine, still waiting for his hand. For years, it had symbolized triumph, the culmination of ambition, strategy, dominance. Now, it looked like a curse. Each page seemed heavier than steel, every clause a chain tightening around his throat. His pen, once steady as iron, now wavered in his grip. Sweat beaded at his temples, trickling down to his collar. He could hear the faint hum of the city far below, millions of lives carrying on, unaware that one decision in this room could ripple through their futures. Emily's words burrowed deeper. Her father's ghost lingered in every line of her trembling voice. Nate saw flashes of his own father's lessons, the values he once swore he would never compromise. Yet here he was, balanced on the edge of betrayal, not just of a company, not just of a family, but of himself. For the first time in his career, doubt eclipsed certainty. The merger wasn't a victory, it was a reckoning. Nate's legacy, once built on steel and glass towers, now teetered on the fragile truth spoken by a child who refused to be silenced. He looked around the room, at the faces of men he had trusted for years, and saw shadows of predators lurking where partners used to stand. Then his gaze drifted back to Emily, her defiance, her grief, her unshakable belief that truth was worth more than gold. The contract blurred before his eyes. His empire felt hollow. His success, a mirage. And for the first time, Nate Harrington, the man who never flinched, felt his hand tremble with the weight of his own conscience. The shouting reached a fever pitch. The polished walls of the Harrington Tower boardroom, once symbols of authority and order, now reverberated with anger, fear, and desperation. Executives leaned over the table, their voices sharp and frantic. Some begged, others threatened, but all of them clawed for control, terrified of what one man's choice could destroy. At the center of it all sat Nate Harrington, his hand clenched tightly around the merger contract. The paper crumpled under his grip, slick with the sweat of his palm. His jaw was rigid, his pulse thundering in his ears. For a moment, the entire world seemed to narrow into this single decision, an empire balanced on the tip of a pen. He looked down at the bold print of the contract, and for the first time, he didn't see opportunity. He saw betrayal. He saw the hollow eyes of men who once stood beside him, now revealed as conspirators in fraud. He saw Emily's face, the fire in her eyes, the trembling in her voice, the echo of her father's sacrifice. And he saw himself, younger, hungrier, swearing that his company would be built on integrity, not greed. A surge of rage swelled in his chest, not at the girl, not at the chaos, but at himself, for almost being fooled, for almost betraying everything he once stood for. His hand shook violently, not from weakness but from the strength it took to resist the easy choice. The executives shouted louder. Harrison Blake slammed his fist on the table, his voice booming like a judge's gavel. "Sign it, Nate. Don't throw away everything we've built." Nate rose slowly, the chair groaning against the marble floor. He held the contract high for everyone to see. The room fell into a tense hush, anticipation sharpening every breath. Then, with one swift, decisive motion, Nate tore it in half. The sound was deafening in its simplicity. A single rip, sharp as a blade, cutting through years of lies and schemes. Gasps erupted across the room. Some executives recoiled in horror, others froze in stunned silence. The papers slipped from his hands, fluttering downward, scattering across the polished floor like ashes of a burned empire. "This company," Nate's voice roared, clear and unshakable, "will not be sold to liars. Not today. Not ever." The words struck like thunder. Faces drained of color. The empire of deceit they had woven so carefully collapsed in an instant. No excuses, no denial could undo what had just been destroyed by a man who finally chose truth over power. For the first time in years, Nate felt the chains of ambition fall away. The burden of empire, the hunger for dominance, the compromises he had once justified, all of it slipped from his shoulders. He wasn't just a CEO standing at the head of a boardroom. He was a man, free and unafraid, reclaiming his soul in front of everyone who had tried to steal it. And as the fragments of the contract lay scattered around his feet, Nate Harrington understood. Sometimes to build a true legacy, you first have to burn the false one to the ground. The city of Chicago buzzed with whispers that had turned into roars. Every newspaper stand bore his name in bold ink, "Merger Scandal Exposed." Harrington CEO saves company from fraud. News anchors dissected the drama, pundits praised his bravery, and cameras flashed wherever he went. But behind the headlines, Nate Harrington no longer felt like the man who once stood untouchable in the glittering glass tower of his empire. He had changed. It was a cool evening at Navy Pier, the kind that painted the horizon in shades of fire and gold. The Ferris wheel spun slowly, its glowing lights reflecting on the water like stars scattered across the waves. Families laughed, street performers strummed guitars, and the air smelled faintly of popcorn and the lake breeze. Amid all this life and light, Nate walked, not with his board of directors, not with bodyguards, but with a little girl. Emily's small hand was wrapped tightly around his, grounding him more than any contract or title ever could. She walked with a quiet confidence, as though the weight of the city's chaos didn't touch her. And yet, Nate knew the truth. Her courage had borne the weight that others, grown men with decades of power, had been too afraid to carry. Reporters trailed in the distance, long lenses trained on them, but for once, Nate didn't care. His smile wasn't for the cameras. It wasn't polished, it wasn't practiced. It was real, clumsy, almost boyish. He hadn't smiled like this in years, not since before ambition hardened him into the man he became. They paused at the edge of the pier, where the city skyline stretched proudly behind them, glass towers glowing in the fading sun. Nate crouched slightly, meeting Emily's eyes so fierce yet innocent, the same eyes that had stormed into his boardroom and shattered his world. His voice dropped, gentle but thick with emotion. "You didn't just save Weston Dynamics," he whispered, his words almost stolen by the wind. "You saved me." Emily's lips curved into the faintest smile, and for a moment, the chaos of Chicago, the headlines, the scandals, the betrayal, fell away. All that remained was a promise, silent but undeniable, a new legacy, one not built on power or deals, but on truth and the courage of a child who refused to stay silent. The Ferris wheel rose higher in the background, its lights flickering like a crown over the skyline, but Nate didn't look at it. His gaze stayed fixed on Emily, on the new chapter that had begun the moment she screamed in defiance in that boardroom. For the first time in years, Nate Harrington walked not as a CEO, not as a man chasing empires, but as someone reborn. And as the waves lapped softly against the pier, he knew this was only the beginning, his dawn, lit by the voice of a little girl who changed everything. The story closes with one lesson. Truth is worth more than any fortune. But what about you? Would you have signed the deal, or torn it apart? Tell me in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more life-changing millionaire stories.